Keanu Reeves pulled up to the modest countryside home, his headlights cutting through the quiet rural night. He stepped out in his simple black hoodie and jeans, drawn by a faint sound, a cry of distress. Inside, the scene was grim. A shattered window, overturned furniture, and an elderly woman lying on the floor, her leg clearly broken. She'd been left there after a violent encounter with unknown intruders. Keanu's instincts kicked in, and he knew he couldn't walk away. What happens next will surprise you. This is a story of courage, compassion, and an unexpected hero stepping in when no one else would. Before we continue the story, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow at 8 p.m., we have another story made especially for you. Keanu Reeves drove quietly along a lonely stretch of countryside road, his car the only source of light in a sea of darkness. It was a calm, peaceful evening, with the faint glimmer of stars overhead and the occasional rustling of trees in the cool night breeze. He had spent the day in meetings and on set, and as the hours stretched late, he felt the need to clear his head. The drive out of the city and into the stillness of the rural outskirts was his way of finding a moment of solitude, a reprieve from the fast-paced demands of his work. The road was one he had traveled before on his occasional retreats. It snaked gently through a patchwork of open fields and small wooded areas, dotted with a few isolated homes. Normally, these houses would be dark and silent by this hour, their occupants long since turned in for the night. But as Keanu rounded a bend, something unusual caught his attention. Up ahead, the glow of light spilled unevenly from a small, modest house tucked away from the road. The porch light flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows, and one of the front windows was wide open, its curtains fluttering in the breeze. Keanu slowed the car, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the property. The house seemed oddly quiet despite the lights, and a strange tension hung in the air. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but something felt off. This wasn't the normal kind of lights left unseen he had seen before. The sense of disturbance only grew stronger as he rolled down his window and let the night air in. A faint, almost imperceptible noise reached his ears, like a distant, muffled cry, then silence again. It was enough to make him stop the car altogether. He switched off the engine, letting the darkness settle around him, and leaned forward to get a better look at the house. A chill ran through him as he noticed a few more troubling details. The front door was slightly ajar, and the bushes near the side of the house were trampled, as if someone had moved through them hastily. It wasn't just the open window or the flickering light. Something clearly had happened here. The whole scene felt unnervingly out of place, like the remnants of an event that no one was meant to witness. Keanu's mind began to race with possibilities. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the house didn't seem abandoned or neglected. Rather, it seemed lived in, warm, even inviting under different circumstances. But now it radiated unease, the kind that settled in his chest and refused to let go. The noises, the disarray, these were signs of a place that had been disturbed, of a night that had taken a sudden, unexpected turn. As he sat there, the scene before him grew more vivid. Though he didn't yet know the full details, he sensed that the peaceful countryside night had been shattered by something dark. This house had become the center of a silent struggle, one that might still be lingering in the still air. He could almost feel the tension of whatever had happened hanging like a low fog over the yard. Keanu didn't yet know what he would find, but he knew he couldn't simply drive on and leave it behind. Something had drawn him to this place, and the more he took in the eerie calm, the clearer it became that this night was far from ordinary. He didn't want to rush in without understanding what might be waiting inside, but the faint, fleeting sound of a cry had settled something within him. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a feeling of responsibility. This wasn't the kind of place where you ignored the signs and drove on. He knew he had to step in. He opened his door quietly, the sound of the latch barely disturbing the still night. The crunch of gravel under his boots was muffled by the soft breeze as he approached the house. There was no movement behind the curtains, no shadows crossing the window, but the tension in the air felt heavier with every step. As he reached the porch, he noticed more details: the splintered wood around the doorframe, the faint scuff marks on the floorboards, and what looked like a piece of fabric caught on the edge of the broken window pane. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been careful. Keanu stopped at the threshold of the open door. He took a breath, steadying himself before pushing it open just wide enough to see inside. The living room, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light, was in disarray. Furniture had been knocked over. A table lamp lay shattered on the floor. Books were scattered, their pages fanned out as though someone had ransacked the shelves in haste. The air carried a faint metallic scent, something not quite right. He could see now that this wasn't just an abandoned mess. This was the aftermath of violence. Then he saw her. Lying on the floor near the far corner of the room was an elderly woman. Her hair was a cloud of silvery white, spread out like a halo around her head. She was dressed in a long, floral nightgown, the fabric bunched up at awkward angles as though she had struggled to move. It was clearly broken, the unnatural angle impossible to ignore. She lay still but not unconscious. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her face, though pale and lined with pain, turned slightly toward him as he stepped into the room. Keanu's presence was immediate. Even as he moved closer, he kept his steps measured and quiet, not wanting to startle her. He crouched down several feet away, meeting her eyes without closing the gap too quickly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and steady, his tone calm. She didn't respond right away, but her eyes blinked, and she gave the faintest of nods. That was enough for him to approach a little closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Kneeling beside her, Keanu saw just how fragile she looked. Her hands, lined with age, trembled slightly as she clutched a small throw pillow that had likely fallen from the couch nearby. He resisted the urge to reach out right away. Instead, he spoke again. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. This time, her lips parted, but the words didn't come. It was as if she wanted to speak but couldn't quite find her voice. Her eyes, however, were enough to convey what had happened. They held a mix of fear and relief, a silent acknowledgement that someone had finally come to help her. Keanu glanced around the room once more, piecing together what little evidence he could see. The signs of a struggle were everywhere: knocked over furniture, scuff marks on the walls, and items scattered as if someone had searched for something valuable. It was clear she hadn't simply fallen on her own. Someone had done this. Someone had invaded her home and left her here, broken and alone. He turned his attention back to her. "Okay, we're going to get you some help," he said. "But I need to know, are they still here?" His question was met with the smallest shake of her head. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him the immediate danger had passed. Whoever had done this was gone, at least for now. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The urgency was still there, but the imminent threat wasn't. It gave him just enough room to focus fully on her needs. Carefully, he shifted closer, lowering himself onto one knee. "I'm not going to move you," he assured her. "I just need to take a look at your leg." As he inspected the injury, it became clear how severe it was. The break was obvious even without any medical expertise. Her leg was swollen, and every slight shift caused her to wince in pain. Keanu worked quickly, removing his jacket and folding it into a makeshift cushion to place gently under her head. "This should make you more comfortable," he said, adjusting it carefully so she wouldn't have to lie directly on the hard floor. The woman's trembling hand reached out, brushing against his sleeve. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes was enough. Keanu felt her gratitude, her quiet plea for someone to just be there and not leave her alone in this vulnerable state. He stayed close, speaking to her in calm tones, reassuring her that help was on the way. As he called for emergency services, he never left her side. His voice was steady and deliberate as he gave the necessary details. "We have an injured woman here," he said into his phone, his tone firm but calm. "She's got a broken leg and needs medical attention. Where at?" He rattled off the address, ensuring that help would come swiftly. When he hung up, he met her gaze again. "They're on their way," he told her. "You're going to be okay." The woman's lips moved slightly, a faint whisper of thanks escaping as her eyes began to close. She wasn't losing consciousness, just succumbing to the exhaustion of the ordeal. Keanu stayed where he was, keeping watch over her as the minutes stretched on, each one heavy with the weight of the situation. He didn't know who had done this or why. Those questions would come later. For now, he had only one priority: ensuring that she was safe, cared for, and no longer alone in the cold, quiet house. And so he remained by her side, a steady presence in the midst of chaos, until the distant sound of sirens began to cut through the night. Keanu Reeves held his phone to his ear, pacing just outside the house, his voice steady and calm as he spoke with the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, it's an elderly woman," he explained, glancing back at the front door. "She's conscious, but her leg is broken. It looks bad. Where at?" He repeated the address clearly, ensuring the responders would find them quickly. As he ended the call, a weight lifted from his chest. Help was on its way. But he couldn't leave her alone, not even for a second. He stepped back inside, crouching down beside the woman again, and spoke softly. "They're coming. I'll stay with you until they get here." Her eyes flickered open, meeting his gaze. Though her voice was weak, she managed a faint "thank you." That single word, spoken through pain, was enough to strengthen his resolve. He knelt by her side, gently adjusting the makeshift cushion under her head, and reassured her with a quiet, "It's going to be okay. You're not alone." Minutes later, the faint wail of sirens cut through the stillness of the night. Keanu's head turned toward the sound, and he exhaled a sigh of relief. He stepped back onto the porch, watching as the red and blue lights pierced the darkness, illuminating the once quiet country road. The ambulance arrived first, its tires crunching over gravel as it came to a stop just outside the house. Paramedics quickly exited, their movements brisk and efficient, carrying their gear and a stretcher as they made their way to the front door. Keanu stepped aside to give them room, but he remained close enough to offer information if needed. One of the paramedics approached him, asking for details. "She's in the living room," Keanu said, his voice low but clear. "Her leg is broken. She's been lying there for a while, but she's conscious. I haven't moved her. I figured it was best to wait for you." The paramedic nodded in approval before heading inside. Keanu stayed by the door, listening as they spoke gently to the elderly woman, asking her questions and carefully examining her injuries. He didn't interfere, but his presence was reassuring not just to her, but to the paramedics as well. They worked quickly, stabilizing her leg and preparing her for transport. When they brought out the stretcher, Keanu saw the woman's eyes meet his again. She tried to smile, the lines of pain still etched on her face, but there was also a glimmer of gratitude. The police arrived shortly after, their car pulling up behind the ambulance. Two officers approached Keanu, who briefly explained what he had witnessed and what the scene inside looked like. "I didn't see anyone else around," he said, "but the house was clearly broken into. I think they were after something valuable. They left her there like this, hurt, alone. I just happened to be driving by and saw that something was wrong." The officers took his statement, their faces somber as they glanced toward the house. One of them assured him they would investigate further, checking the property for any evidence the intruders may have left behind. Keanu climbed into the ambulance after they secured her stretcher, sitting quietly near the back corner, out of the way. As the vehicle began its journey toward the hospital, he felt the bump of the road beneath him and the steady rhythm of the siren overhead. The paramedics worked methodically, checking her vital signs, securing her leg in place, and monitoring her responses. Keanu sat close, silent but present, his calm demeanor offering an unspoken assurance that someone cared, someone would see this through. When they reached the hospital, the staff moved quickly to admit her. Keanu followed the stretcher down the hall, staying just outside the treatment room once they ushered her inside. He didn't want to interfere with the medical team, but he also didn't want to leave until he knew she was in stable hands. As nurses and doctors moved swiftly, speaking in clinical terms and preparing to set her leg, Keanu waited in the corridor, pacing slowly. It wasn't long before a nurse approached him, her expression a mix of curiosity and appreciation. "Are you family?" she asked. "No," Keanu replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I was just passing by. I saw she needed help." The nurse nodded, perhaps understanding more than her neutral expression let on. "Well, she's stable now. They'll need to do some scans and treat the injury, but she's in good hands. You did a good thing bringing her here." Keanu thanked her and returned to his quiet vigil outside the room. He decided to stay a little longer, just to make sure she was settled and comfortable. When the staff allowed it, he stepped into her room. The elderly woman looked frail against the crisp white sheets of the hospital bed, but her eyes opened and met his. They were tired, but warm, and for the first time, she spoke more than a word. "You didn't have to stay," she said, her voice raspy but grateful. "I couldn't leave," Keanu replied simply. "You needed someone here." She smiled faintly, a gesture that held more meaning than words could convey. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a peaceful quiet, not the tense stillness of earlier that night. Keanu stayed a while longer, offering small reassurances until the woman's eyes drifted closed, her breathing soft and steady. Only then did he quietly excuse himself, leaving her to rest in the care of the hospital staff. As he walked back through the hospital corridor and into the cool morning air, Keanu felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had done everything he could. The world outside was still dark, but the faintest hint of dawn was just beginning to creep over the horizon. After some time, As the hospital quieted and the steady beeping of monitors replaced the rush of footsteps, Keanu sat by the elderly woman's bedside. She was resting more easily now, the medical staff having set her broken leg and administered pain relief. For the first time since he found her, her face had softened. She looked at him with a mix of gratitude and feigned embarrassment, as though she hadn't fully expected anyone to care this much about what had happened to her. Keanu leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd her. "You're safe now," he said gently, his voice as calm as it had been all night. "If you're feeling up to it, do you think you could tell me more about what happened?" The old woman's fingers fidgeted with the hospital blanket, her movements slow and deliberate. She hesitated for a moment, her lips pressing together, then spoke softly. "It was just after dinner," she began. "I'd made some soup, nothing special, just an old recipe I like to make when it's cold out. I was sitting in my chair near the window, watching the sunset. That's when I heard the sound of glass breaking. I thought, maybe something fell off the counter or a bird flew into the window. But before I could even stand, they were inside." Keanu's brow furrowed as he listened, his focus entirely on her words. She paused, closing her eyes as if trying to steady herself before continuing. "They didn't say much, just told me to stay quiet and not cause trouble. They started going through my things, drawers, cupboards, even the bookshelf. I didn't have anything valuable, nothing anyone would want to steal. I tried to tell them that, but," she trailed off, her voice quivering as she relived the moment. Keanu waited patiently, nodding slightly to encourage her to continue. "Finally," she said, "I knew one of them. Or at least, I'd seen him before. He's a friend of my grandson's. They used to come by sometimes, play cards in the living room, talk about movies or music. This young man, he always looked at things in my house. Not just looked, stared. I remember thinking it was odd. He'd run his fingers over the picture frames or pick up little knickknacks, always holding them a bit too long, like he was weighing them in his mind. I thought he was just curious. But now," her voice broke slightly, and she clutched the blanket a little tighter. "Now I think he was looking for something. I don't know what, but he must have decided it was worth breaking in for." Keanu's face didn't shift, though his mind raced with the new information. He thought back to the state of her home, the ransacked shelves, the broken glass, the overturned furniture. The damage wasn't random. It was targeted, methodical. Whoever had done it wasn't just vandalizing the place out of malice. They were searching for something specific. He leaned forward a little more, his voice calm and steady. "You're sure it was him?" She nodded faintly. "I couldn't see his face clearly. He kept his head down. But the way he moved, the way he held my vase before he knocked it over, it felt familiar. I think he recognized me, too. I caught him glancing at me, and it wasn't the look of a stranger. It was like he was debating what to do next. I tried to call out to him, to say his name, but that's when they pushed me. I don't remember much after that, just the pain when I hit the floor." Her voice wavered again, but there was strength behind it now. "I've known my grandson's friends for years. Most of them are good boys, polite, friendly, helpful. But this one, he was different. Always a bit too quiet, always watching. I should have known." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. It sounds like he had been planning this for a while, or at least thinking about it. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "Does your grandson know what happened?" The woman shook her head. "Not yet. I haven't seen him in a few days. He's working long shifts now, trying to save up for school. I didn't want to bother him. He doesn't know that his friend came back, or what he did. I'll have to tell him soon, but I just don't know how." Keanu offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to worry about that right now. Let's focus on getting you better first. The police will take it from here. They'll talk to your grandson if needed, and they'll track down the person who did this." The woman relaxed a little, her shoulders easing down into the pillows. "I just can't believe it. He used to sit at my table, drink my tea, laugh at my stories. How could he?" Her voice trailed off, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Keanu stayed quiet for a moment, letting her process her thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice warm and steady. "People can be complicated," he said. "Sometimes they make choices that don't make sense to the rest of us. But that doesn't mean you should blame yourself. You opened your home to him because you're kind, not because you were naive. It's not your fault he betrayed that kindness." She looked at him with a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "I suppose you're right. It's just hard to accept." "I understand," Keanu said gently. "But you don't have to accept it all at once. Just take it one step at a time." The woman closed her eyes, her breathing steadying. For the first time, she seemed less burdened by the events of the night. Keanu sat back in his chair, still alert, but now more at ease. He could tell that speaking about the young man, about her suspicions, had lifted a small weight off her chest. She wasn't alone in carrying it anymore, and that, at least, was a start. Keanu sat quietly in his car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring down the empty stretch of road. The old woman's words weighed heavily on him, painting a picture of a betrayal that went far beyond material loss. It wasn't just the broken window, the scattered belongings, or the bruises on her frail body. It was the trust that had been shattered. She had welcomed this young man into her home, treated him with kindness, and in return, he'd left her injured and vulnerable. Keanu wasn't going to let that stand. The police were already investigating, but he felt a personal obligation to intervene directly, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because someone needed to face this young man and make him see the damage he'd caused. As the sky turned from deep blue to the faintest hint of dawn, Keanu started the car, determined to find the culprit before the sun fully rose. It wasn't hard to track down where the young man lived. The old woman's grandson had mentioned it once in passing during a visit, and in a close-knit rural area, people tended to know each other's business. Keanu drove cautiously, each turn of the wheel bringing him closer to the address he'd recalled from the woman's story. The road narrowed as he neared the outskirts of town, where smaller houses sat nestled among overgrown fields and the occasional rusting pickup truck. Finally, he spotted the place, a modest, weather-beaten house with a sagging front porch and a yard strewn with forgotten tools. Keanu parked a short distance away and sat for a moment, letting the silence of the early morning settle around him. He wasn't here to start a fight. He wasn't here to lecture. He was here to give this young man a chance to face what he'd done and make it right. Taking a deep breath, Keanu stepped out of the car and walked up the narrow path leading to the front door. When he knocked, there was no immediate answer. The house was dark and still, and for a moment, he wondered if the young man was even home. Then he heard shuffling from inside, hesitant, almost reluctant footsteps. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a young man in his early 20s. His hair was messy, his eyes tired, and his posture defensive. He clearly recognized Keanu, though he said nothing at first, his gaze darting from the actor's face to the ground. "Can I help you?" the young man finally mumbled, his voice low and wary. Keanu didn't waste time. "I just came from the hospital," he said. "I've been with your friend's grandmother all night." The young man froze, his expression shifting from wary to panicked. I don't know what you're talking about." Keanu held his gaze, his tone calm but firm. "She told me what happened. She told me how you've been to her house before, how you looked at her things, how you knew exactly what you were after when you broke in." The young man's jaw tightened. He took a step back, but Keanu didn't follow. He simply stood there, his presence steady, unthreatening but unyielding. "You left her on the floor," Keanu continued, his voice still calm, "with a broken leg, bleeding, and pain. You just walked away." "I didn't mean for that to happen," the young man snapped, his voice rising in a mix of anger and guilt. "I didn't mean for her to get hurt." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe you didn't. Maybe you thought you'd just take what you wanted and leave. But she did get hurt, and now she's lying in a hospital bed because of what you did." For a moment, the young man didn't respond. His fists clenched at his sides, his breathing uneven. Then he slumped against the doorframe, his eyes cast downward. "I needed the money," he muttered. "My mom's sick. I'm behind on rent. I didn't know what else to do." Keanu's tone softened, though it remained serious. "I'm not here to judge why you did it, but you have to understand that what you did hurt someone who trusted you, someone who didn't deserve to be hurt." The young man looked up, his eyes glistening. "What do you want me to do?" "Take responsibility," Keanu said firmly. "Fix what you can. Turn yourself in. Talk to the police. Explain what happened and try to make amends. It's the only way to start making this right." The young man shook his head, his fear and guilt evident. "If I turn myself in, they'll lock me up. What's going to happen to my mom? What's going to happen to everything I've been trying to keep together?" Keanu took a step closer, still careful to keep his tone measured. "That's something you'll have to face. But hiding from it won't make it go away. You're already carrying this weight. Doing the right thing might be hard, but it's the only way you'll ever have a chance at moving forward. It's the only way you'll find peace with yourself." The young man ran a hand through his hair, his movements anxious. He leaned against the doorframe, staring at the ground. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Keanu waited, his expression patient but firm. He wasn't going to force the young man to act. He couldn't. All he could do was offer him a path forward, a way to start making things right. Finally, the young man nodded, though his face was still lined with uncertainty. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll talk to the police." Keanu didn't react immediately. He let the words settle, studying the young man's face for any sign of deception. But what he saw wasn't a criminal trying to dodge blame. It was a scared, remorseful young man who had made a terrible mistake and was now standing at a crossroads. "Good," Keanu said simply. "It's not going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do. And it's the first step toward fixing what's been broken." The young man nodded again, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what lay ahead. Without another word, Keanu stepped back from the door, giving the young man room to process what he had just agreed to. As Keanu walked back to his car, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the countryside. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all anyone can hope for. After their conversation, Keanu made sure the young man followed through. With the boy's permission, he called the police directly from the driveway and let him explain everything. Keanu stayed nearby, a quiet support as the young man nervously admitted to what he'd done and offered to make amends. The officers, while firm, recognized the sincerity in his voice. They promised to investigate the case fully and ensure that justice would be fair and not unnecessarily harsh. They also noted Keanu's involvement, though the actor made it clear he wasn't looking for credit. He just wanted to help the woman and make sure the situation was resolved. Over the following weeks, he kept in touch with the elderly woman, visiting her regularly as she recovered in the hospital. On one particular visit, he brought her a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked up on the drive over. She greeted him with a smile, her leg propped up on pillows, the soft cast a reminder of the ordeal she'd survived. "I can't believe how much you've done for me," she said, her voice a little stronger each time he saw her. "I never expected anyone, especially someone like you, to care so much." Keanu waved it off humbly, as he always did. "I just did what anyone should. You've given so much to your grandson and his friends. It's only fair that someone steps up for you." But Keanu wasn't done. As her recovery progressed, he spoke privately with her grandson, making sure the young man understood what had happened. Together, they agreed to organize some financial help to ease her burden. Keanu, who had quietly reached out to his personal network, arranged for repairs to her home and set up a fund to cover her medical bills. The local community, inspired by the story, even pitched in, donating time and resources to restore her house and bring it back to the safe haven it had once been. When the woman finally returned home, she was greeted by a group of neighbors who had come together to clean up her yard, mend her fence, and repaint her door. Her face lit up when she saw it, tears filling her eyes. "I never knew people could be so kind," she whispered to Keanu. "They can be," he said with a gentle smile. "It's just a matter of showing them how. You've been giving to others your whole life. Now it's your turn to receive." As the woman settled back into her home, Keanu's visits became less frequent, though he promised he'd always be just a phone call away. The incident, though painful, had brought the community closer. People began to check on one another more often. The young man who had committed the crime was on a path of redemption, volunteering at the local community center as part of his restitution. And Keanu, who had quietly catalyzed these changes, faded back into his usual low profile. Before his final visit, he left the woman with a few words. "Life can be full of challenges," he said, "but it's how we come together, how we choose to respond, that defines us. You've shown resilience and grace through all this. Never forget that your strength, combined with the kindness of others, can turn even the darkest moments into something bright." And with that, Keanu headed back down that same countryside road, leaving behind not just a house restored, but a community renewed and a legacy of quiet compassion. If you like the story, visit our channel for more great stories of heroism, compassion, and resilience. And if you missed our last story, I will leave it here for you. Wish you enjoy it.
On a lonely highway in the Nevada desert, Keanu Reeves stopped at a small gas station to refuel his motorcycle and grab a coffee. It was a place forgotten by time, where dust blended with the scent of old gasoline. A teen girl behind the counter seemed like just another exhausted figure at the end of a long day, but something in her eyes told a different story. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing that she was just a child, no older than 12. It was the invisible tension hanging in the air, the way her hands trembled as she handed back the change, the watchful eyes of the man keeping a close eye on her. When Keanu picked up the receipt and absent-mindedly turned it over, his body tensed. The handwritten words made his blood run cold. You won't believe how this story ends. It will keep you on edge from start to finish. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The road cut through the desert like a forgotten scar. The road cut through the desert like a forgotten scar. The heat made the asphalt shimmer under the setting sun, and Keanu felt the warm wind against his face as he rode his motorcycle. He liked empty roads, but this stretch of Nevada desert felt too empty. When he saw the only gas station for miles, he decided to stop. The flickering neon sign read Open 24H, though some letters were burned out, giving the place a rundown feel. He slowed down, parking next to the only working pump. The door to the mini-mart creaked open, and a young girl stepped out. Keanu immediately noticed something different. She was far too young to be out here alone. She was thin, her oversized uniform hanging loosely on her small frame. Her eyes were sunken, dark circles etched deep, and her shoulders seemed permanently hunched. She avoided making eye contact. "Good evening, sir. Fill up?" Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Keanu nodded. "Full tank, please." She started fueling, but her hands were slightly trembling. Keanu didn't like that. Something felt off. The mini-mart door swung open again. A man stepped out. Matt. Tall, broad-shouldered, hard-faced. He said nothing. He just stood in the doorway watching. But Keanu noticed how the girl immediately dropped her gaze when he appeared. Matt never took his eyes off her. When the girl fumbled slightly with the gas nozzle, Matt's expression hardened. "You're taking too damn long." His voice was cold, sharp. The girl hurried immediately without looking up. Keanu saw that, and he didn't like it. After fueling up, Keanu decided to step into the mini-mart. The inside was cluttered and dimly lit, with shelves filled with expired products. The air smelled of stale coffee. The girl stood behind the counter, wearing the same vacant expression as before. Matt remained near the door, watching everything. "Just a coffee, please," Keanu said. She moved quickly, but her hands shook slightly, causing a few drops to spill. Matt let out an exaggerated sigh. "Jesus, can't even hold a damn cup right." She didn't respond, just grabbed a cloth and wiped up the spill as fast as possible. Keanu took his coffee, but something about that moment disturbed him deeply. When Keanu handed over his money, the girl hesitated for a split second before giving him his change. She didn't look him in the eye, but when their hands briefly touched, Keanu felt the faintest squeeze of her fingers. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, like she was trying to say something without words. Then, in a swift motion, she slid the receipt into his hand. Keanu took it without reacting. The girl immediately pulled back. Matt was still watching, and he looked suspicious. Outside, Keanu took a sip of his coffee as he walked to his bike. The desert was too quiet. He glanced at the receipt before stuffing it into his pocket, but as he folded it, he saw something handwritten on the back. "Help. Please, don't let him see this." Keanu's heart beat harder. He lifted his gaze and discreetly looked back at the mini-mart. The girl was inside now, standing behind the counter, her hands resting over her small frame. And then he noticed something even stranger. Matt was locking the door, slowly turning the key like he was sealing the place. Keanu felt his pulse quicken. He could simply ride away. But now he knew something was very wrong. The girl wasn't just trapped in this gas station. She was a prisoner, and Matt wasn't letting her go. Keanu couldn't just leave. He immediately lifted his eyes. Inside, she stood behind the counter, her hands instinctively placed over herself, the movement subtle, protective. And then for just a second she looked at him, but it was enough. That look didn't just ask for help, it begged. Keanu felt tension rise in his chest, and then the door to the mini-mart clicked audibly. He turned his head just in time to see Matt locking the door, sealing the place. The girl wasn't just trapped here, she was a hostage, and Matt wasn't letting her leave. This wasn't just coincidence. It was control, and Keanu couldn't just leave. He switched off his engine slowly, pretending to check something on his dashboard. But in reality, his eyes were analyzing everything around him. And now, he saw clearly. This place wasn't just some rundown gas station. It was a prison hiding in plain sight. He started noticing alarming details. Windows covered with newspapers blocking any view from outside. Only one working security camera pointed at the cash register, ignoring the rest of the store. The gas tank was never completely full. This place wasn't running like a real business. It was just a front, and the girl was part of it. He needed to stay calm. He couldn't just barge in and take her. If Matt had been controlling her this long, he wouldn't hesitate to take things further. Keanu moved to the side of the building, pretending to check his bike. And then, he heard it. A muffled noise, like something being knocked over. And a moment later, a short, sharp scream. The girl. The decision was made in that instant. Keanu wasn't leaving without her. He heard the muffled noise again, followed by the short scream, forcing him to take immediate action. He didn't hesitate. He moved quickly to the side of the mini-mart, testing the side door handle. Unlocked. That was strange. If Matt was so controlling, why leave a side entrance unsecured? Maybe he never expected anyone to have the guts to come in. Keanu pushed the door open slowly, slipping inside without making a sound. The smell hit him first. Old oil, dust, a place that should have been clean for customers but was clearly neglected. This didn't feel like a legitimate business. It was something else, and now Keanu needed to figure out what. The shelves were messy, as if no one really cared about organization. The products were expired, some by months. That meant the gas station wasn't really there to sell gas and groceries. It was just a cover for something bigger. As Keanu moved past the shelves, he heard something, a noise coming from a slightly open door in the back. He stopped, holding his breath. He stepped closer and peeked inside. That's when he saw it. The girl. She was sitting on a dirty mattress, a light chain around her ankle. Her eyes widened when she saw Keanu, but before she could say anything, she raised a finger to her lips. Silence. Keanu immediately understood. She couldn't call for help. She wasn't just an employee. She was a prisoner. Keanu clenched his fists slowly. Matt wasn't just controlling her. He had stolen her identity, her documents, her freedom. And from the way she trembled, he had hurt her before. Keanu moved closer, slowly. The girl spoke fast and low. Please, you have to leave. He'll be back soon. Keanu looked at the chain on her ankle. Does he always keep you like this? She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. He took me months ago. I tried to run, but she looked down at her arms. Bruises. Keanu felt a weight in his chest. This girl wasn't just a victim of abuse. She was being held against her will. And Matt didn't seem like the kind of man who would let this go easily. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a small knife. Stay quiet. He crouched down, starting to cut through the chain. Then, heavy footsteps behind him. Keanu knew instantly. Before he could turn around, Matt's voice echoed through the room. What the hell do you think you're doing? Keanu stood up slowly. Matt was standing in the doorway, gripping something at his waist, a hunting knife. He was smiling. A cold, cruel smile. You shouldn't have gotten involved. He didn't have time to finish unlocking the girl's chain. What the hell do you think you're doing? Keanu slowly rose to his feet, preparing for the inevitable. Matt stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, gripping a hunting knife. His face didn't show rage. It showed control. That meant only one thing. He had done this before, and worse, he believed he could do it again. Matt let out a slow, casual laugh, adjusting his grip on the knife. Did you really think you could just walk into my store and walk out like nothing happened? Keanu didn't answer. He knew what Matt wanted. A reaction. He wanted to see fear. He wanted Keanu to play his game. But Keanu didn't play games. He stood his ground, waiting. Matt continued, Let me guess, you think you're saving her, right? He glanced at the girl and chuckled. Because so far she hasn't said a damn word. The girl held her breath, frozen. Keanu could feel her eyes on him. She trusted him, but at the same time she feared what Matt might do. Matt stepped closer. The knife caught the dim light, glinting like a warning. I've seen guys like you before, meddling where they don't belong, thinking they're some kind of hero. But in the end, he tilted the blade toward Keanu. They walk out of here in worse shape than when they came in. Keanu still didn't react because he was waiting for something, the sound of sirens. But it wasn't time yet. He needed to stall Matt a little longer. Matt turned to the girl. "Tell him, do you want to leave with this guy?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the knife. Matt sighed, shaking his head. "See, she doesn't want to go." Keanu noticed the confidence in Matt's voice. He wasn't in a rush. That meant Matt thought he had complete control over the situation, and that meant he wasn't prepared to lose. Keanu could use that against him. He relaxed his body, exhaling slowly. "Okay." Matt narrowed his eyes. "What?" Keanu took a small step back, opening his hands. "If you say she wants to stay, then I'll leave." Matt hesitated. This wasn't what he expected. "That's right," Keanu continued, taking another step back. "Looks like I wasted my time here." Matt relaxed, and in that moment, Keanu moved. With a sudden burst of speed, Keanu grabbed the nearest chair and shoved it into Matt. Matt stumbled backward. It was enough. Keanu lunged, striking Matt's arm, knocking the knife away. Matt tried to recover. He swung at Keanu, landing a glancing punch to his face. But Keanu was ready. He dodged and brought Matt down with a precise strike. Matt hit the floor hard, gasping for air. Keanu grabbed the knife from the floor. He looked at the girl. "Grab the keys and get out of here." She hesitated, still shaking. But then Matt laughed. Even after everything, he still thought he was in control. "You think this is over?" Keanu didn't respond. He simply glanced at his watch. 30 seconds left. Matt noticed the look on Keanu's face, and then, outside, sirens. Matt froze. Keanu exhaled slowly. "I called the cops the second I heard her scream." Matt tried to move. He knew he couldn't afford to be caught, but Keanu held him down. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed outside. The girl began to cry, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was relief. Matt glared at Keanu with hatred. "You ruined everything." Keanu held his gaze firm. "You ruined yourself." The red and blue lights from the police cars flashed against the cracked asphalt of the gas station. Officers stepped out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, prepared for anything. Keanu raised his hands, making it clear the threat had already been neutralized. Matt lay on the ground, his breath heavy, his eyes filled with hatred. As the officers approached him, he didn't fight back. He knew he had lost. 2 officers yanked him to his feet, swiftly handcuffing him, while another turned to the girl. She was sitting on the ground, hugging her knees, her whole body still shaking. "Miss, are you injured?" One officer asked, his voice calm but firm. She didn't answer at first. She just shook her head as if she didn't even know how to start processing everything. Keanu, still standing nearby, noticed how pale she looked. Her hands, still cradling, her small body trembled slightly. Keanu had seen trauma before. This wasn't just exhaustion. It was the weight of everything she had endured. He crouched beside the girl, meeting her gaze. For a moment, she just stared at him. "It's over." His voice was calm, reassuring. Her lips quivered as if trying to say something, but no words came out. She slowly turned to look at Matt. Even handcuffed, he was still trying to intimidate her. His stare was dark, burning with unspoken threats. But this time, she didn't look away. For the first time, he no longer had power over her. She inhaled deeply, the kind of breath someone takes when they've been holding it in for far too long. The officers led Matt toward one of the patrol cars, his boots scraping against the pavement as they pushed him forward. She watched in silence. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't the end. It never was. "You don't have to know right now." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can be normal again." After a few minutes, an officer handed the girl a bottle of water. She accepted it, but her hands were still trembling. Keanu noticed. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. She looked at him. She wanted to talk, because Keanu was the first person to really see what was happening. She took a deep breath, and then she started. I'm from Kansas. Keanu stayed silent, just listening. My mom died when I was 7. My dad never recovered. She frowned, as if recalling painful memories. He started drinking, and when he drank, he changed. Her fingers gripped the water bottle tightly. By the time I was 11, I knew I had to leave. I spent years trying to figure out how. She let out a weak laugh. When I turned 12, I took everything I had and bought a bus ticket to Las Vegas. I thought I'd get a job. I thought things would get better. Her laugh faded, quickly. I was so naive. She hesitated. This part was harder to say. I made some bad choices. Keanu didn't react, just listened. I met people who acted like they wanted to help, but they didn't. Her breathing hitched slightly. I found myself in the streets, homeless. Keanu clenched his jaw but kept his expression neutral. You were left alone. She nodded. No money, no place to stay, no one to turn to. Her hands instinctively gripped her arms, as if protecting herself. That's when Matt found me. She turned toward the gas station, as if staring at a ghost. He saw me at a diner, said I looked tired, that he could help me. Keanu already knew where this was going, but he let her finish. At first, I believed him. She let out a shaky breath. But then, he took my ID. She paused, swallowing hard. That same night, he locked the door for the first time. Silence. Then, she looked down at her hands. I don't know what to do. Keanu followed her gaze. You don't have to know right now. Her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know if I can be normal again. Keanu's tone was steady. That's your decision, no one else's. Her eyes blinked, glossy with unshed tears. For the first time, someone wasn't telling her what she should do. She finally had a choice. Hours later, Keanu stood outside the police station. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. The girl stepped out of the front doors, now wearing clean clothes provided by the officers. She looked tired, but for the first time, she looked free. She saw Keanu by his motorcycle and smiled softly. So where are you headed now? Keanu shrugged. Just following the road. She nodded. He reached into his jacket and handed her something, an envelope. She opened it and saw money inside. Keanu, I can't take this. He gave her a knowing smile. Yes, you can. Her fingers gripped the envelope tightly. What do I do now? Keanu met her gaze. Whatever you want. You're free. Keanu placed his helmet on and got on his bike. Are you going to be okay? She smiled. Yeah. Before leaving, he looked at her one last time. Be free. The wind blew, carrying with it the receipt. The one with the message. Help. Now it was no longer a cry for help. It was proof that someone had listened and made a difference. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.